The stars outside the window flickered as the ship hurtled through the vast emptiness of space. Inside, everything seemed calm. The crew members, though on edge from the long journey, were quietly going about their tasks, preparing for what would be a routine landing on a remote planet. The mission was simple: gather data, explore, and return home. But nothing ever goes as planned in the unknown corners of the universe. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the ship, followed by a series of jolts that threw everyone off balance. The lights flickered as the ship's alarm blared to life, filling the small craft with a harsh, shrill warning. "What's happening?" shouted Commander Jensen, rushing to the control panel. I don't know," shouted Lieutenant Harper, her fingers frantically tapping at the console in front of her. "The navigation systems are offline. Something's wrong with the thrusters. We're losing altitude." The ship shook again, even harder this time. The crew struggled to keep their footing, their bodies thrown back and forth as the ship plummeted faster and faster. Jensen's heart raced as he tried to regain control, but the ship was out of his hands. The console was flickering, showing static where data used to be. He had no idea where they were headed, or even if they were going to make it out alive. "We need to brace for impact," Harper shouted, but it was already too late. With a violent crash, the ship slammed into the ground. The impact was so sudden and powerful that everything inside the ship seemed to break apart. A bright light flooded the interior for a moment. And then, silence. The ship lay still, half buried in the dirt of an unknown world. For a moment, everything was quiet. The ship's emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow over the wreckage. Smoke filled the air, and the sound of hissing engines could still be heard in the distance. The crew lay scattered, dazed from the sudden crash. It was only when Commander Jensen stirred, groaning as he regained consciousness, that anyone moved. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice raspy and weak. One by one, the other crew members slowly sat up. Harper was the first to speak, brushing debris from her uniform. I think we're alive." "That's the first good news," said Dr. Ellison, the ship's scientist, as he helped the communications officer, Ava, to her feet. "We need to assess the situation," Jensen said, wiping blood from his forehead as he stood up. "Are we near a settlement? Can we communicate with Earth?" Harper looked out the cracked window. "I don't see anything familiar. It's just wilderness. Nothing in sight." Jensen looked around, his heart sinking. They were stranded on an unknown planet. The wreckage of their ship lay in a clearing surrounded by dense alien vegetation. There was no sign of civilization, and worse, no way to contact home. Panic began to settle in, but the commander fought to keep it at bay. "We'll need to gather supplies," Jensen ordered, his voice firm despite the fear rising inside him. "We don't know how long we'll be stuck here. Everyone, grab what you can from the wreckage. We'll need to start thinking about survival." The crew quickly moved to assess the damage. Supplies were scattered across the wreckage, some food rations, tools, and a few emergency packs. But their most important resources, the communications equipment, were destroyed in the crash. As the crew worked, they couldn't ignore the unease growing in their chests. There was something off about this planet. The air was thick, the atmosphere heavy, and the silence seemed unnatural. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, but there was no animal sound. No birds, no insects, nothing. Harper stood still for a moment, staring at the dense forest that stretched for miles in every direction. She shivered. It was as if the planet was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to Jensen. Jensen looked up from the wreckage. "Hear what?" "Silence," she said, her voice tense. "The wind, the trees, everything. It feels wrong." Jensen frowned. "It's probably nothing. We're just disoriented from the crash." But deep down, he felt the same sense of dread growing in him. There was something about this place that didn't sit right. They were alone, stranded, and something told him that the planet was about to show them just how dangerous it truly was. The crew gathered their supplies, and Jensen gave the order to move away from the wreckage. "We'll head for higher ground. See if we can get a better view of our surroundings." As they walked through the dense jungle, the feeling of being watched never left them. They were being followed. It wasn't just the quiet, unnatural stillness that unsettled them. It was the way the trees seemed to bend and shift, as if something was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. The crew walked on, unaware that something far more dangerous than they could imagine was already aware of their presence. They had no idea that their real nightmare was only just beginning. And in the distance, something stirred, watching them with hungry eyes. The hidden dangers. The crew walked cautiously through the dense underbrush of the alien world. The thick air pressed down on them as they made their way towards the higher ground, hoping to get a better sense of their surroundings. Every step they took seemed to amplify the eerie silence that surrounded them. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed, not even the sound of a breeze rustling the leaves. It was as if they had stepped into a world untouched by life. Commander Jensen led the group, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel the tension building, like they were being watched. But every time he turned to look behind them, there was nothing. Just the thick trees and the fog that hung low in the air. "Stay sharp," Jensen said, his voice low and urgent. "We don't know what's out there." The crew nodded in agreement, but no one spoke. They were all too preoccupied with the unsettling feeling that something was lurking just beyond their sight. Lieutenant Harper walked beside him, her hand resting on the weapon holstered at her side. It was a precautionary measure, but it gave her little comfort. She had seen enough of the universe's dangers to know that guns were often useless against the truly terrifying threats. The jungle around them seemed almost alive, like the very ground was aware of their presence. The thick, twisted vines that draped over the trees were swaying slightly, even though there was no wind. The leaves rustled in a rhythmic pattern, almost as if something was following them, staying just out of sight. Harper's unease grew with every step, but she kept her thoughts to herself. "We need to find higher ground," Jensen said again, his voice firm, even though he too felt the creeping sense of dread. "There has to be something out there. A building, a settlement, anything." The crew trudged on, but the terrain only grew more difficult. The thick vines tangled around their feet, and the underbrush was so dense that they had to cut their way through with machetes. It felt like they were getting deeper and deeper into the heart of the jungle with no way out. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. Finally, after what felt like hours of slogging through the dense jungle, they reached a small clearing. It was an odd sight, the clearing almost too perfect, as if nature itself had shaped it into a space. In the center, a small, shallow pond reflected the dim light that filtered through the thick canopy above. But even in this isolated spot, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it only grew stronger. There was something about the place that didn't feel right. Harper knelt beside the pond, dipping her fingers into the cool water. Her eyes widened as she pulled her hand back quickly. Something was wrong with the water. It wasn't clear like it should have been. It was murky, with a strange, oily sheen on the surface. "Commander," she called out, her voice tight. "The water's contaminated. It doesn't look safe." Jensen stepped over to her, examining the water closely. His brows furrowed, a sense of concern creeping into his mind. He had hoped for a fresh water source, but now it seemed they were in more trouble than they had thought. "I'll radio back to the ship for supplies," Jensen said, reaching for his communicator. But as his fingers brushed against the device, a loud crack sounded through the trees. It was followed by a strange rhythmic thumping. Everyone froze. What was that? Ava, the communications officer, whispered. Harper, still kneeling by the water, slowly stood up, her hand still on her weapon. "I don't know, but we're not alone here. And whatever it is, it's big." Jensen's heart pounded in his chest. The thumping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like someone was coming towards them. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew they couldn't outrun whatever it was. They needed a plan. The thumping stopped suddenly, and a strange guttural growl echoed from the trees. The crew tensed, turning toward the sound, but there was nothing in sight. The jungle around them was deathly still again, but now they knew they weren't alone. Something was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Stay together," Jensen ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "We move quietly. No sudden moves." The crew nodded, their eyes darting around as they slowly began to retreat, walking backward toward the jungle's edge. They kept their weapons ready, the sounds of the jungle pressing in on them. The thumping was gone, but the growls still echoed in their minds, rattling their nerves. Suddenly, a low hiss split the air. It was so loud, so sharp, it seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath their feet. Then, in the blink of an eye, something shot out of the trees toward them, moving faster than the eye could follow. Harper raised her weapon, firing at the creature, but it was already gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The crew stood frozen, fear settling in like a thick fog. "What the hell was that?" Dr. Ellison whispered, his voice trembling. Jensen swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." With that, they turned and ran. The jungle erupted into chaos as they sprinted through the underbrush, unsure of what was chasing them or what might be waiting ahead. They only knew one thing. They had to get out of this alien nightmare. And the worst part, the creatures weren't done hunting them. Not by a long shot. The hunt begins. The jungle seemed to close in around them as they ran. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick underbrush, but the sound of their hearts pounding in their chests was deafening. The crew was on edge, eyes darting back and forth, trying to anticipate every movement. Every shadow in the trees felt like a predator watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Commander Jensen was in the lead, pushing through the dense foliage with his machete. His mind raced, trying to calculate their next move. The sudden appearance of the creature had thrown everything into chaos. They had no idea what they were dealing with, and that terrified him. Was it a single predator, or was there a whole pack lurking in the shadows? Whatever it was fast, efficient, and deadly. "Keep moving," Jensen shouted over his shoulder, his voice trained with urgency. "We can't stop here." The crew followed, their movements frantic. Lieutenant Harper was close behind him, her breath ragged, her hand tightly gripping her weapon. She was alert, scanning the treetops, the ground, and the air around them. She had been in dangerous situations before, but something about this place, this world, was different. The fear gnawed at her insides, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being stalked. Behind her, Dr. Ellison stumbled, catching his foot on a vine, but Ava, the communications officer, grabbed his arm to steady him. "Hurry up, we don't have much time," Ava urged, her voice tight with panic. The sound of movement in the trees echoed around them. Something was out there, moving with them. But whenever they turned to look, there was nothing. The jungle remained eerily still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the right moment. Then it came. A shriek, high-pitched, inhuman, and chilling, split the air. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against bark. The trees around them seemed to tremble with the force of the creature's movement. "There," Harper shouted, pointing to the thick foliage on their left. "It's coming from over there." The crew didn't wait to confirm. They turned and ran, their pace quickening as they moved deeper into the jungle. The trees seemed to bend and twist around them, as if the very world was closing in, narrowing their escape routes. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, trying to trap them. "Where's the ship?" Ellison gasped, looking desperately over his shoulder. Jensen's eyes flicked to the sky, searching for any sign of their transport ship. But all he saw was the thick canopy of trees, blocking out any view of the stars. They were completely cut off from any support. "It's too far," Jensen shouted. We're on our own now. A rustle of leaves to their right caused the crew to turn in unison, weapons raised. A shadow moved swiftly through the trees, its form too quick to be identified. Then, without warning, it lunged. Harper fired, but the creature dodged with impossible speed, its movements almost a blur. It let out another terrifying screech and disappeared into the trees. The crew froze, their bodies tensed, ready to react at a moment's notice. "Keep moving," Jensen ordered again. His voice was strained, but there was no choice. Standing still would only make them easier targets. The jungle seemed to grow more oppressive with every step they took. The air was thick, humid, and heavy, making it harder to breathe. Sweat dripped from their faces, but they couldn't afford to stop. The hunt was on. Suddenly, Dr. Ellison collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg. I can't move anymore," he gasped, his face contorted in pain. "Get up, Ellison. We don't have time for this," Harper shouted, her voice desperate. I think it's broken," Ellison groaned. Jensen's mind raced. He couldn't afford to lose a crew member, but there was no time to waste. The creature was closing in, and they were already at a disadvantage. "We have to keep moving," Jensen said, his voice hard but full of resolve. "Harper, Ava, help him up. We can't leave him behind." Harper and Ava moved quickly, each taking one of Ellison's arms and helping him back to his feet. They stumbled, dragging him along as they pushed forward, every step filled with fear and desperation. The jungle around them felt like it was alive, almost as though it was aware of their every movement. Every step they took, every breath they inhaled, seemed to bring the creatures closer. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them gave way. A massive hole opened up in the jungle floor, sending all of them tumbling into the dark depths below. The last thing they heard before the world went black was the growl of the creature from above, its terrifying presence looming just out of reach. Into the abyss. The world seemed to shift violently as the crew plummeted downward. The thick, humid air rushed past them, mixed with the distant sound of creatures howling in the jungle above. Jensen had barely a second to register the drop before his body slammed into something hard and unforgiving. His breath was knocked out of him, and for a moment, everything went dark. When he opened his eyes, he was surrounded by darkness. His chest heaved, trying to suck in air that seemed too thick to breathe. It was hard to tell how deep they had fallen, but the dark void around them felt like it could stretch on forever. He struggled to push himself up, the pain from his landing shooting through his ribs. But he ignored it, forcing his mind to focus. His crew was depending on him. "Harper," he called hoarsely, his voice echoing in the still air. "Ava, Ellison." A groan came from beside him. Ava's voice was weak but steady as she responded. "We're here. Just give us a second." Jensen's hands reached out, finding his crew one by one. Harper's arm was nearby, her breathing shallow but steady. Ellison was still, his head resting against the cool stone of the ground, and Jensen could feel his pulse beneath his fingers. "We're alive," Jensen muttered to himself, the words barely audible. But the reality of their situation was quickly sinking in. The hole they had fallen into wasn't just a pit. It was a cavern, a massive underground space, its walls slick and cold to the touch. There was no sign of the surface above, no glimpse of light from the outside world. The air was thick with humidity and something else, an eerie, suffocating presence that seemed to weigh on their minds. "Can we climb back out?" Harper asked, her voice strained as she tried to sit up. Jensen shook his head, scanning their surroundings. The walls were smooth, offering no handholds or ledges to scale. Above, the jungle had already swallowed up the hole they had fallen through, and the dark abyss below showed no signs of a way out. "Not unless we find another way," he said, his voice tense. "We're stuck down here." Ellison let out a weak laugh. "Great, just what we needed." His tone was sarcastic, but it was clear that fear had taken hold of him, as it had of all of them. Harper, ever the pragmatist, pushed herself up, surveying the dark cavern. "We need to find shelter. Whatever's out there might be waiting for us to panic." Jensen nodded, his eyes darting to the shadows that surrounded them. The cavern stretched endlessly in all directions, its depths unknown and its walls silent. But something was stirring in the darkness. He could feel it. It was like the air itself had thickened, as if the creatures of the death world were aware of their fall and were preparing to close in on them. "I don't think we'll be alone for long," Jensen muttered. He unslung his weapon, checking its readiness as the rest of the crew did the same. Ava stood, her eyes narrowed. "This place doesn't feel right. It's too quiet, like it's waiting for something." "Yeah," Harper agreed, her voice a whisper, "waiting for us." Jensen motioned for them to move forward. "Stay close. We need to find a way out of here before we become something's next meal." The team moved as one, every step cautious and deliberate. The cavern was vast, and though their torches barely illuminated their immediate surroundings, the flickering light cast long, monstrous shadows. The walls were jagged, and the floor was uneven, with sharp rocks and craggy outcroppings that could easily break an ankle if they weren't careful. The air felt thick with something else too, a strange, chemical scent that made their stomachs churn. The deeper they ventured, the more the smell seemed to grow stronger. It was a pungent, almost metallic odor, mixed with a faint undertone of decay. "What the hell is that?" Ava asked, wrinkling her nose. "I don't know," Jensen replied, his voice laced with unease. "But it's not something we want to find out up close." Ellison, who had been limping along behind them, suddenly stopped, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with fear. "Guys, listen." The crew froze, their weapons raised. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their breaths and the distant drip of water echoing through the cavern. But then, faintly at first, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against rock. Getting closer, moving with a chilling precision. "It's them," Harper whispered, her voice barely audible. Jensen's heart began to race. He could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The helplessness of being trapped in an alien world with no way out. His mind raced, calculating their options, but there was no clear solution. Every direction they moved seemed to bring them closer to danger, and the shadows were getting longer, darker. The sound grew louder now, scraping, dragging, almost deliberate. And then, in the distance, the flickering light from their torches illuminated something moving in the dark, something large. The shape was too big, too fast. The creature appeared to be circling them, its eyes glinting in the shadows. "We need to move. Now." Jensen barked, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. As the crew turned to flee, the creature's screech split the air, sending shivers down their spines. The hunt had begun. The hunter's trap. Jensen's pulse was pounding in his ears as he motioned for the crew to move quickly. The cavern seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching unnaturally as the creature's screech echoed from every direction. The sound was maddening, bouncing off the jagged walls, making it impossible to tell which direction the predator was coming from. They scrambled over the uneven ground, their footsteps clumsy and panicked. Ellison, still favoring his leg from the fall, was lagging behind, his face pale with fear. The fear of what hunted them had a cold grip on their hearts, but the fear of being left behind was even worse. "Ava, get him moving," Jensen barked, his voice tight with urgency. Ava grabbed Ellison's arm, pulling him forward, while Harper stayed at the front, scanning the darkness ahead with her weapon raised. Every few seconds, her eyes darted to the walls, the floor, anywhere the creature might be hiding. The screeches grew louder, almost deafening. Then there was a sudden silence, broken only by the sound of their frantic breathing. "What happened?" Ellison gasped, looking over his shoulder as if expecting the creature to leap out from the shadows. "We lost it. For now," Jensen said, though the uncertainty in his voice was evident. His eyes flicked nervously around the darkened cavern. It was hard to shake the feeling they were being watched. "We need a plan," Harper muttered, lowering her weapon for a moment. "We can't just keep running. The longer we stay down here, the more likely we'll run into something worse." Jensen nodded, his thoughts racing. They were trapped, and the more they tried to escape, the deeper they went into the underground labyrinth. Every direction they moved seemed to bring them further into the unknown. He had to think quickly. "We need shelter, somewhere to regroup," he said, trying to control the fear creeping into his voice. "If we don't stop and figure this out, we'll get picked off one by one." Ava turned to him, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Shelter? Where? There's nothing down here but rocks and darkness." Jensen glanced up. The cavern stretched upward, its ceiling far out of reach, but there was something strange about the walls. They had noticed it before, but hadn't had the time to examine it. Jagged formations jutted out from the sides, unnatural formations, too symmetrical to be natural. They looked like doors, but not of any design Jensen had ever seen before. The realization hit him. "Those formations," Jensen said, his voice low with both excitement and trepidation. "They're not just rocks. They're something else." "What do you mean?" Harper asked, squinting at the formations. "I think they might lead somewhere. We could take shelter inside one of those, whatever they are." "Great," Ellison muttered sarcastically. "A dark, creepy rock formation in the middle of a death world. What could go wrong?" Jensen didn't have time to argue. They needed to act before the creature found them again. Without another word, he started toward the nearest formation, his weapon raised and ready. The rest of the team followed close behind, their movements cautious but swift. As they approached, the sense of dread intensified. The formations were much taller than they had seemed from a distance, and now they towered over them, casting long, menacing shadows. Jensen stepped forward, his hand brushing against the stone. It felt cold to the touch, like the very essence of the death world had seeped into it. It was as if the rock itself was alive, pulsing with some unseen force. He took a deep breath. "We'll have to go inside. We don't have a choice." The team hesitated for a split second before stepping into the shadowed entrance. As they passed through, the air grew even thicker, almost suffocating. The tunnel inside seemed to narrow, the walls pressing in as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. The tension in the group was palpable. Each step felt like it might be their last. They were not just fighting the creatures of the death world, but the very environment itself. An alien world that was as hostile to them as it was beautiful. They continued forward, deeper into the unknown, when suddenly a shrill cry pierced the silence. The creature. It was closer than ever. Jensen's heart raced as he turned to his crew, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't wait here. Move, now." They ran down the narrow corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The walls seemed to close in on them as the creature's screech grew louder, closer. It was right behind them now. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she looked behind. "It's following us. It's right on our tail." Jensen's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The corridor ahead was a dead end, and there was no time to turn back. He had to act. He had to find a way to lose the creature. But before he could make a move, something else happened. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder, reverberated through the walls. It was like a hum, low and vibrating, almost mechanical. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and for a split second, Jensen thought it was just the creature's approach. But then he realized it wasn't the creature at all. It was something else, something far more dangerous, and it was coming from ahead. "Get ready," Jensen whispered, his voice filled with both fear and determination. "We're not alone down here." The walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse again, and then the ground beneath their feet cracked open. The trap had been set. The trap springs. Jensen's heart raced as the ground beneath them gave way, the jagged rocks splitting open like the maw of some monstrous creature. His eyes widened in panic, but there was no time to react. The tunnel floor collapsed with a deafening crack, and in the blink of an eye, the team was falling. The air whooshed past them as they plummeted into the abyss, their bodies twisted and contorted in the fall. Jensen tried to control his breath, but the sheer speed and chaos left him breathless. His mind scrambled, searching for anything to hold on to. There was nothing. They were falling into the depths of the death world. In the midst of the freefall, he heard screams. Ellison's, Ava's, Harper's. Their voices echoed as they descended deeper into the darkness. The moment felt like an eternity, but then the fall abruptly ended with a hard, jarring thud. Jensen's world spun, and for a moment, all he could do was breathe, trying to recover from the shock. His body was bruised, his limbs aching, but nothing felt broken. He opened his eyes, blinking in the dim, unfamiliar light. The ground was solid beneath him, though uneven and rocky. He groaned and pushed himself to his feet, looking around. The others were scattered around him, all groaning, slowly getting up from the painful fall. Ava, Harper, Ellison. Jensen called out, his voice hoarse. He tried to stand but stumbled, the shock of the fall making his legs weak. "I'm here." Ava's voice came from his left. She was already standing, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell just happened? Where are we?" Jensen took a deep breath and looked around. They were in some kind of cavern, but it was unlike anything they had seen before. The walls were slick and smooth, and the air was thick with an almost electric charge. The ground was uneven, covered with strange, glowing rocks that pulsed faintly. "This isn't just a collapse," Harper said, her voice shaky. "It was a trap. We were set up." Jensen nodded grimly. It was clear now. The death world wasn't just a force of nature. It was intelligent, calculating, and it had been watching them. Every move they made, every step they took, had been anticipated. And now, they were in its grasp. He scanned the cavern, trying to make sense of their surroundings. There were no immediate exits, no signs of life, except for the unsettling hum that seemed to resonate from the walls. It was like the very air in this place was alive, vibrating with an eerie energy. "Stay close," Jensen ordered, his voice firm. "We don't know what else is down here. We need to move." They gathered their gear, checking their weapons and supplies. Each of them was visibly shaken, but they knew they had to push forward. The trap had been sprung, and now they had no choice but to face whatever was waiting for them in the dark. As they moved deeper into the cavern, the strange hum grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. It was as though the very world itself was alive, its pulse matching theirs in an unsettling symphony. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught Jensen's eye. It was quick, a blur in the shadows. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. But then, the movement was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harper nodded, her eyes darting to the shadows. "I saw it. We're not alone." The tension in the air was thick. Every sound, every flicker of light made their hearts race. The death world was toying with them, and they had no idea what it wanted. But whatever it wasn't going to be easy to escape. They continued through the cavern, the hum growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the darkness stretched out endlessly ahead. It was as if the very cave itself was guiding them, pushing them forward toward something they didn't understand. Then suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. It wasn't just a vibration this time. It was an earthquake, or something far worse. The walls cracked, and a loud rumble filled the air. Jensen's eyes widened as the ground split open in front of them. A massive fissure appeared, swallowing the cavern floor and widening with terrifying speed. They had to move, and fast. "Run," Jensen shouted, grabbing Harper's arm and pulling her toward the nearest ledge. Ellison and Ava followed close behind, their faces etched with fear. The earth beneath them buckled and cracked, sending rocks tumbling down into the abyss below. Jensen's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to keep his footing. The ledge they were on was narrow, and the shaking made it difficult to maintain balance. He glanced behind them, seeing the ground giving way as the cavern seemed to collapse inward. Suddenly, the hum intensified, a screeching, high-pitched noise that seemed to tear through their very bones. The walls trembled with the force of it, and Jensen felt his ears ring. "What the hell is that?" Ava screamed, her voice barely audible over the sound. "It's the Death World," Jensen shouted back. "It's alive. It's fighting back." The fissure widened even further, and the ground beneath their feet gave way once more. But this time, Jensen wasn't going to let them fall into the abyss. He grabbed Ava's hand and pulled her toward a jagged rock formation, hoping it would be enough to keep them from falling. They clung to the rock, their hearts racing as the cavern continued to shake. The walls were crumbling around them, and the Death World was showing no signs of mercy. But then, amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. The walls stopped shaking. The rumbling ceased. The cavern fell eerily silent. Jensen could barely catch his breath as he slowly turned to look around. The tremors had stopped, and the strange hum was gone. The Death World, it seemed, had gone still, waiting for something. Jensen's mind raced. They had survived, but at what cost? What had they just unleashed? And what was the Death World's next move? The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. They were far from safe, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Jensen took a deep breath, his grip tightening on his weapon. They weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. The final confrontation. The silence in the cavern felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Jensen's heart pounded in his chest, each beat resonating in the stillness around him. Every sense was heightened, and the only sound he could hear was the faintest whisper of his team's breathing. The Death World had been quiet for too long. Jensen slowly stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dark. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than any danger they had faced so far. He knew that whatever the Death World was planning, it would be worse than anything they could imagine. "Ava, Harper, Ellison, stay close," Jensen ordered quietly, his voice low, almost a whisper. There was no telling what kind of trap the world had set for them next. They had been toying with them since they landed, and now, it seemed, the game had changed. They moved forward cautiously, the eerie glow from the rocks casting strange shadows on the walls. The floor beneath their feet was uneven, and every step felt like it could be their last. It was as if the world itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And then it happened. A massive roar echoed from deep within the cavern, shaking the walls and rattling the air. The sound was deafening, a bone-shaking cry that seemed to come from the very heart of the Death World itself. Jensen's blood ran cold. This wasn't just the roar of a creature. They had awoken something far worse. "We need to move now," Jensen shouted. The urgency in his voice propelled the team into action. But as they started to run, the cavern began to shift around them. The walls cracked open, revealing massive, pulsating tendrils that writhed in the darkness. They were everywhere, stretching out like living, breathing vines, closing in around them. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Something was rising from the depths of the world, something ancient, something far more powerful than anything they had faced before. Jensen's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Ava by the arm and pulled her toward a narrow passage to the left. "Go," he shouted. "Get to the exit. I'll cover you." But there was no exit. There was no escape. The tendrils lashed out, faster than human eyes could follow. One wrapped around Harper's ankle, pulling her off the ground. She screamed as she struggled to free herself, but the more she fought, the tighter the tendril became. The other tendrils moved in, surrounding the team. Jensen pulled out his weapon and fired into the nearest tendril, but the shots barely made a dent. They had no time to waste. The creature, or whatever it was coming for them, and there was no place to hide. "Hold on," Jensen shouted. He ran toward Harper, but before he could reach her, a massive shadow loomed overhead. Something massive was descending from above, its form monstrous, incomprehensible. It was a creature the likes of which they had never seen before. Its body was made of shifting shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the heart of the death world, and it had come to finish what it had started. Jensen's mind raced. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was humanity's final stand against a force that had no mercy. The creature's tendrils lashed out again, but Jensen dove forward, grabbing Harper and pulling her free from the creature's grasp. "Run," he shouted, but it was too late. The creature's jaws snapped shut, blocking their only escape. They were trapped. With no other option, Jensen turned and faced the beast. It was massive, towering over them with its black, roiling form. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its maw was filled with razor-sharp teeth. Jensen raised his weapon, aiming for the creature's glowing eyes. He fired, but the shots had no effect. The beast snarled and lunged, its tendrils reaching for him with terrifying speed. In that moment, something deep within Jensen's core shifted. It wasn't fear that surged through him. It was rage. Rage for everything they had endured, for everything they had fought for, and for the people they had lost. This death world had underestimated them. He fired again, this time with precision. The shot hit the creature's glowing eye. The beast recoiled, screeching in pain, and for the first time since landing on this hellish world, it faltered. "Now," Jensen shouted. "While it's distracted." The team didn't need to be told twice. They rushed forward, firing their weapons, aiming for any weak spot they could find. They had no illusions about their chances, but they weren't about to go down without a fight. The creature howled, thrashing in pain, its tendrils flailing wildly. But even as it writhed, the team didn't stop. They kept firing, hitting it from every angle. Every shot, every hit, was another step toward their survival. And then, in a final desperate act of defiance, Jensen aimed his weapon at the beast's core, at the heart of its twisted form. He pulled the trigger. The world seemed to freeze. There was a blinding flash of light, and the creature's massive body convulsed. Its tendrils went limp, falling to the ground with a sickening thud. The air went still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the death world fell silent. Jensen collapsed to his knees, exhausted and battered, his hands trembling as he lowered his weapon. His team stood around him, equally spent, their faces etched with the marks of battle. They had survived. Against all odds, they had fought back the creature that had tried to claim their lives. But the death world wasn't finished yet, and neither were they. The battle for humanity's survival on this deadly world had only just begun.